One of the quickest ways to end a chess game is to overwhelm your opponent by getting an extra queen. And to get an extra queen, you're going to need to get one of your pawns to the other side of the board. Like this. And in order to do that, you're going to need what is called a passed pawn. A passed pawn is one that has a straight shot to the other side of the board without bumping into another pawn or being able to be captured by another pawn. The pawn has passed all the other pawn obstacles. Look at the pawn on f5. Is this a passed pawn? No, it's blocked by the pawn on f6. What about the pawn on b5? That's right, it's not blocked by any pawns and cannot be captured by another pawn as it advances up the board, so it's a passed pawn. One important feature of passed pawns is whether they are connected or not. Let's see what happens when you have a passed pawn that isn't connected. After b6, black can play king to c6, easily capturing that pawn before it gets to queen. In this position, white can save the pawn on b6 with the move c5. White has two connected passed pawns. Black will not be able to capture either of these pawns. Notice if black tries to take the pawn on c5, the other pawn runs up the board and promotes into a queen. Finally, you often can create a passed pawn by trading one of your pawns for one of the opponent's pawns when you have a pawn majority. A pawn majority is when you have more pawns on a certain side of the board than your opponent. In this position, white has two pawns against one pawn. This is a pawn majority, and white plays b6. After a takes b6, white captures back and now has a passed pawn. Can you make the most of your passed pawns? Let's see. It's a wonderful thing when you have a pawn that can freely run to the other side of the board and queen. But that usually doesn't happen. Your opponent is going to do everything possible to stop your pawn. This is why you will usually have to escort your pawn with your own king. In this position, black uses the king to step in front of the white king to create a virtual shield so that the black pawn can run to the promotion square. After king to f2, white's king cannot move closer to the pawn, so the king tries another path to get to the pawn with king to d3. After g3, there goes the pawn. There's no stopping it after g2. And black promotes. In this next position, looking at the board from white's perspective, white moves the king up the board where it can protect its pawn for the last several moves of its journey. After king to c7, black is absolutely powerless to stop this plan. The pawn is protected by its escort, the king. There's no stopping this pawn. Let's look at one of the most classic endings. White has a pawn on the a-file known as a rook pawn. If black's king can get into the corner on the a8 square, black will prevent white from promoting the pawn, drawing the game. If white doesn't pay attention and just pushes the pawn forward, this is what can happen. Let's take a look. Black's king can no longer be prevented from getting to the corner on a8. White's pawn advances up the board, and black's king keeps getting closer to it. White's pawn is now in serious danger, so white plays king to c6, moving the king closer to its pawn. After king a7, black's king threatens to win the pawn, so white plays king b5, protecting the pawn. After king a8, black's king sits in the corner, so white plays king to b6, forcing black's king out of the corner. After king b8, black will simply move back and forth from b8 to a8 until white pushes the pawn forward with a7. After king a8, if white does not want to move away from its pawn and allow black to capture it, forcing the draw, then after king a6, the game is a stalemate. Black has no legal moves, but the king is not in check. This is why it's so important for white to block the black king from getting into the corner first and then focusing on escorting the pawn. That's why white should play king to c6. After king to d8, black's king gets closer to the corner, but white puts an end to that with king to b7. White's king blocks the king's path to the corner and will now escort the pawn up the board. Black plays king to d7, hoping to get to white's pawn in another direction. And after a4 and king d6, the black king has to spend extra time moving around the white king. a5, king to c5, and after a6, king to b5, black's king makes contact with the pawn, but it's too late after a7. White will promote to a queen on the next turn. Now let's see if you've learned how to escort your pawns. As you know, the object of the game is checkmate. On the way to checkmate, you have to gain a winning advantage. such as queening a pawn before your opponent and using that extra material to win the game. In this position, white is so close to getting a queen, but there is a black pawn in the way. Can you find a sacrifice which opens up a line for white to queen? f6. Excellent. White sacrifices the f6 pawn in order to clear open the path for the g-pawn to promote. If black doesn't take the pawn, white will simply capture black's pawn and promote on the next move. So after g takes f6, white's sacrifice clears the way for the g-pawn to promote. And after g7, white will promote well before black can, and the extra queen for white will win the game. Now let's look at another position. This position looks all locked up with no way to get through. Or is there? That's right. After bishop takes a6, white sacrifices the bishop. If black doesn't take the bishop, white will take the pawn on b7 and push the a-pawn up the board to promote. If black captures the bishop with b takes a6, the b file is open for white's pawn to promote to a queen. After b7, thanks to the bishop sacrifice, white will promote to a queen on the next turn. Gaining a queen becomes much more important than losing a bishop. But what about this position? Is there any way for black to break through and to promote the pawn on a3? Yes, with a double sacrifice. After knight takes b3, black sacrifices the knight for a pawn. If white doesn't take the knight, then black will play knight to d4, attacking the pawn on c2, and also the bishop on e6 would threaten the pawn on a2. Not a good situation for white. After c takes b3, black sacrifices a second piece with bishop takes b3. Black is trying to open up the path for the a-pawn to promote. If white doesn't take the bishop, black will simply capture the a-pawn and push the passed pawns up the board to promote. After a takes b3, black plays a2. Black will promote the pawn into a queen and overwhelm white's position. Now let's see if you can sacrifice in order to promote and win. Oftentimes, the best moves in chess come from looking several moves into the future. Moves that look bad at first glance can actually be winning moves. Let's look at a position that seems to be even. Both white and black have 3 pawns, and if white pushes one of those pawns here, then black can just capture, and it looks like a drawn position. But let's look deeper. What is the goal of the endgame? To queen a pawn. If you can do that before your opponent, your queen can usually capture any other pawns and then force checkmate. So would it be worth it then to give away 2 of your 3 pawns if that third pawn could become a queen? Yes, it would. And in this position, you can do just that. The first move seems reasonable, pawn to g6. And if black captures, you can capture back, right? Well, you could, but that isn't the winning move. See if you can find a sacrifice that clears the way for you to promote a pawn. f6. Excellent. The pawn on f6 threatens to capture the black pawn on g7 and will promote into a queen on the next move. After g takes f6, white plays h6. White will promote to a queen in 2 moves and capture black's pawns well before black can promote. What if black tries to get an extra move in the pawn race by ignoring the f6 pawn and capturing white's pawn on h5? Let's see. After g takes h5, white will play f takes g7. Notice black's h-pawn is no match in the promotion race against white's pawn on g7. After h4, g8 equals queen, white promotes first, and black's pawn is nowhere near promoting. After h3, queen g3, white's queen easily catches the h-pawn. After g6, since capturing with the h-pawn loses, does capturing with the f-pawn work any better for black? After f takes g6, if you find the right move, white can promote one of the pawns into a queen. Can you find the winning move? That's right, h6. White uses the same idea. By attacking the pawn on g7, white is able to sacrifice the h-pawn so the f-pawn can run up the board and promote. So after g takes h6, white is able to play f6, and white will win in the same way we just looked at. Now it's your turn to practice sacrificing your pawns to force a promotion. When deciding to trade pieces, it's worth remembering the phrase, "to take is a mistake." Unless a trade improves your position or makes your opponent's position worse, you should think twice before automatically trading even pieces, such as a bishop for a bishop. There is a time when even trades are actually good, and that is when we are up material. If I have 5 apples and you have 3 apples, and we each remove 1 apple at a time, who's going to run out of apples first? The person with less apples, right? The same idea applies to chess. Even trades are no longer even if one side has more material. Let's look at some examples of trading pieces to win the game. In this position, white is up 2 pawns, but it will not be easy to win since white's king is exposed to checks from black's queen. If white could trade the queens, white's 2 connected passed pawns would easily win the game. Can you find a way to trade queens and enter a winning pawn ending? That's right. After queen a8, check. This forces black's king to move. After king f7, queen takes g8 check, king takes g8, white will easily win the game after a4. Black's king cannot stop the a-pawn from promoting into a queen. In this position, black is up a queen for a rook. Notice that black has 2 advanced pawns on the queen side, b4 and a4. White's rook on f3 is trying to slow these pawns down and prevent them from advancing. With black to move, can you find a way to force one of black's pawns through on the queen side? The easiest way is to remove white's main defender, the rook. After queen takes f3, Black sacrifices a queen for the rook because now black's pawns on the queen side cannot be stopped. After g takes f3, a3, black will soon promote to a queen and should win the game easily. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, is any side ahead in material? That's right, black is up an entire rook and bishop. Notice though, white has a pawn on g6 and a queen on h3, causing trouble, threatening checkmate on the very next move. What if black could force the queens off the board and black would still be up a rook? Is a rook enough to win the endgame? Yes, being up an entire rook should be enough to win the game. Can you see how black can force the queens off the board and trade down into a winning endgame? That's right, queen f1 check. Black trades a queen and a bishop for white's queen. Black is willing to give up material to enter a completely winning endgame where white has no counterplay. After queen takes f1, bishop takes f1, king takes f1, black can easily win this endgame, beginning with the idea of removing white's advanced pawns with rook to d8. Now it's your turn to practice trading down to win. One of the trickiest endgames to play is when a passed pawn is being chased down by the opposing king. How do we know if the king will catch the passed pawn in time before it is able to reach the promotion square? We can count every single move by both sides to try and find the answer, but this takes time and we risk miscounting the moves. Fortunately, there is an easier way to find the answer with only a quick glance at the board with little to no calculation required. This method is known as the square of the pawn. Let's take a look at this position. White has a pawn on a4. Let's draw a diagonal from the a4 pawn and connect it up the board in the same direction as the enemy king, like this. a4 and e8 are two of the corners of the square. The other two corners are a8 and e4. Did you notice that we formed a square? If black's king can enter the square before the pawn moves, the king will catch the pawn before it promotes. In this position, with black to move, can black's king on f3 enter the square of the pawn and catch the passed pawn? Yes, it can, with king e4. Black's king is now in the square of the pawn. Let's watch the black king chase down white's passed pawn. After a5, king d5, a6, king c6, a7, king b7. Black's king catches the passed pawn just in time, securing the draw by entering the square of the pawn. Let's take a look at this position again, but this time with white to move. After a5, can the black king on f3 catch the pawn? No, because the square of the pawn is now on a5, d8, d5, and a8. After king e4, a6, white's pawn will safely promote before black's king can catch it, so white will win the game. Let's take a look at one more position together. There is one case when entering the square of the pawn does not work. It only happens when the pawn is on its original square and is able to move 2 squares on the first turn. In this example, the white pawn is on a2. So if we draw the square of the pawn, we bring the diagonal all the way up the board toward the enemy king and connect the corners. Notice after king g2, since white's pawn can move 2 squares on the first turn, a4 shrinks the square to the corners a4, e4, e8, and a8. Since black's king cannot enter this square, black's king will not be in time to catch the pawn. Let's practice using the square of the pawn method to see if the passed pawn or the king chasing it will win the race. Grandmaster Aaron Nimzovich said, "A passed pawn is a criminal that must be held under lock and key." Passed pawns are that dangerous. If they are not kept under watch, a passed pawn can easily run up the board and promote. That's why creating a passed pawn in an endgame with few pieces remaining to stop it from promoting can win you lots of games. Let's take a look at some examples. In this position, white's pawns on a6 and b5 are advanced, but the black pawn on a7 blocks one of the pawns and is ready to capture the other pawn if it advances to b6. Since both kings are on the other side of the board, if white can force a passed pawn, the game will soon be over. White will promote to a queen and win the game. Can you see how white can force a passed pawn? That's right, b6, threatening to capture the pawn on a7. After a takes b6, the a file has been cleared for white's a pawn to promote. White plays a7 and will promote to a queen on the next move and win the endgame quickly. In this example, white's pawn on d6 is blocked by the d7 pawn. Can you find a way to turn this blocked pawn into a passed pawn? The sacrificial blow, rook takes e6. Capturing black's bishop either wins a piece and soon the game, or after d takes e6, the newly passed pawn moves to d7, promoting on the next move. Let's take a look at this position. White plays b4, and after a takes b4, white's newly created passed pawn advances with a5. Is black in trouble? Not if black's king can enter the square of the pawn formed by connecting the square the pawn is on, a5, with the other 3 corners, d8, d5, and a8. After king d5, the black king enters the square of the pawn before the pawn can move, so black's king will catch white's passed pawn. After a6, king c6. Notice if white plays a7, the black king will catch the passed pawn with king b7. So white should change plans and attack the b4 pawn before black's king can protect it. Now that you've learned the importance of passed pawns, it's your turn to practice forcing passed pawns.